G'day everybody, Spud here from Spud's Games. Welcome back to my YouTube channel. Today's video, I'm going to be running you through my Sega Saturn collection. Stay tuned. So let's talk about the console itself. Released in, I think, about 1994, 1995 by Sega. Initially in Japan, then the rest of the world. Now, unfortunately for the Saturn, about 12 months after it was released, the PlayStation 1 was also released, and the PlayStation 1 went on to sell about 100 million units. Compared that to the Saturn, which only sold about 10 million units. Now, of those 10 million units, about half of them were in Japan, so that didn't leave much for the rest of the world to share out. So if you are struggling to find a console in the American market or the PAL market, then that's probably why. There's just not a lot of them around. One other reason why the Sega Saturn might not have done so well is the Sega CD, which was released I think in about 1992 or 1993, was actually still running in parallel with the Sega Saturn. So all the developers that were developing for the Sega CD were a little bit confused about where they were going to develop their games next for. Was it going to be the Saturn or was it going to be the Sega CD? Now the Sega CD or the Mega CD was discontinued in about 1996. So there was sort of a 2-year overlap there as well. So it was just a little bit confusing for everyone, and the Saturn itself never got a real fanfare release, so to speak. It was quite subdued. And personally, I never even knew it was released. I didn't have a Sega Saturn until I started collecting games, 10, 15 years ago. So yeah, it just didn't get a wide release, particularly here in Australia. They're really hard to find, and it just didn't sell very well at all. So as for the models of consoles that were released, there was essentially 2 variants. There was a couple more, but 90% of them would be covered across 2 models. That was the Model 1 and the Model 2. The Model 1 you can tell by sort of a much skinnier, slantier on-off button, and it also has a shiny front face plate on the front as well. The Model 2, it's pretty much all a black matte finish. This is in the PAL regions I'm talking about. A PAL black matte finish with grey circular on-off buttons and a reset button as well. So cosmetically they do look a little bit different. Functionality wise, I've never come across anything different between the 2 consoles from a video output, from a functionality point of view. They seem to be the same. I know there's different revisions in boards just from modding the Model 1s and Model 2s. There's obviously different revisions in boards internally. There's also different laser assemblies that we used across the 2 models, but all in all, I don't see really any, if you're looking to collect, there will be no real advantage having one over the other. I will say throughout collecting that I have found the Model 1s to be probably less probably prone to not working than what the Model 2s are. Sorry, they're more prone to not working than what the Model 2s are. I don't know whether that's just because they're a little bit older or not, or maybe it's the laser assemblies, I don't know. But I'm not saying they can't be repaired, but I just find that the Model 1s tend to not work as often as what the Model 2s did. As for consoles that I have in my collection, I have 5 all up. I have a Japanese Model 1. Now it works, but unfortunately it does have an issue with its video connector or the capacitors around the video connector itself. It just tends to have a bit of a dodgy connection, so I will get to fixing that one day. It doesn't look like it's a very hard repair. And then I've got 4 PAL consoles, one of which is a Model 1, the other 3 are Model 2s. It's two of those 3 Model 2s are actually complete in box. So I have 5 all up. The reason I have 5, it's not purely because I can have 5, it's just because I get worried that eventually one of them's going to fail, so it's an easy swap out one for the other. That's the only reason why I carry so many. And Sega Saturn's being so hard to get a hold of, especially in original and PAL, then I have confidence now that if one breaks, I can at least swap it out while I'm fixing the one that's broken. So as for the setup I use, it's pretty simple. As I mentioned before, I have a Model 2 with a 50-60 Hertz switch in it. It just hangs out the back, and when I'm not using it, I just tuck it up in the battery compartment and it just sits there until I need to change frequencies. Now, as for multi-regions, I use, hopefully you can see that, Game Shark. Now, it not only has cheat codes on it and saves, etc. in memory, it also enables you to be able to play other region games on what I have, a PAL console. There is only one game I know that doesn't work for, and that's Panzer Dragoon Saga. Thankfully, my copy of Panzer Dragoon Saga is a PAL copy, so I really don't need that Game Shark in there when I'm playing that game, because the console doesn't have any problem playing it normally. So that's the reason why I use the Game Shark. I do have multiple games which I'll touch on later on across different regions, so that's why I like to have the Game Shark in my collection. As for controllers, I use a retro 8-bit Bluetooth controller. And the adapter there. I have two of these. The controller, I find, is it's comfortable. It's exactly the same specifications as what the original Sega Saturn controller is. I think it's actually even licensed by Sega as well. It has a Sega Saturn symbol on it, and it just recharges via a micro USB cable. And it does give you, a solid battery life. I've only had to charge this 2 or 3 times since I've had it, and I've had it for about 18 months. So. It does hold its charge for a long time. I don't notice any lag on it, which is good for a Bluetooth controller. I've had the original Sega Saturn wireless controllers before, but I found them a little bit bulky in the hands, because the batteries actually go in the back of them, and it makes them quite thick and heavy. So I much prefer these retro 8-bit controllers, and I highly recommend, if you've got a Saturn, then one of your first investments is grabbing these, because you'll be forever tripping over cables and looking for controllers, etc. otherwise. So that's my setup. It's pretty simple, really. Video signal I use is RGB SCART. That's just standard for me. If my console can output RGB, then that's what I use. So it just goes straight into the Otaku SCART switch, and then feeds up to the CRT that I use, which also accepts RGB in. Now moving on to the games. So all up, I have about 80 to 85 games in my Sega Saturn collection. Every time I count it, I seem to get a different number. So I'm going to say 80 to 85, of which there are a mix of regions. I have 20 odd JNTSC games, which are import friendly. They're not heavy Japanese language games. They're either shooters or they're fighters. And they're pretty easy to play, and you don't really need to understand Japanese to be able to play them. I do have some American NTSC games as well, such as Guardian Heroes and Mortal Kombat, and an exclusive there, NTSC exclusive Astal, and then the rest are made up of just PAL games. So the one thing the Saturn was known for was doing arcade ports and conversions really well. When we look at arcade shooters, we look at games like Darius 2, Dodonpachi, Parietis, just to name a couple. Then we've got the arcade fighters, the Street Fighters. We've got the Mortal Kombats. Then we've got the Marvel series of fighters, such as Marvel vs Street Fighter, Marvel Superheroes vs X-Men, and there was just a Marvel Superheroes game as well. And then we've got the arcade drivers as well, which they also did really well. Who can forget, you did Daytona. I mean, I don't know how many dollars I spent at the local arcade playing Daytona. Never actually got past the first track. But yeah, I must have spent hundreds of dollars playing Daytona. And the same for Sega Rally. Sega Rally back in the day was my always go-to as well, Daytona and Sega Rally in the arcade. As I said, not very good at them, but I really enjoyed playing them. And they are really good arcade ports for the Saturn. Then you've also got games like Sega Touring Cars, and also Virtual Racing. And then you've got your arcade shooters, or the light gun games such as your Virtual Cops. Also you've got House of the Dead, just to name a couple. So the Saturn itself, it does have a wide genre of games, but it was predominantly known as a really good console for your arcade ports and conversions. One good thing about going and collecting for the Sega Saturn, I started collecting for the Sega Saturn, I suppose started 8 years ago, and I still collect for it to this day, but majority of my games and consoles were collected sort of up until 3 or 4 years ago, And since then, they've become really hard to get a hold of, especially the games, and they've just seemed to have skyrocketed in price. My collection here, I only have, as I said, 80 odd games in those consoles, and it sits at about $6,000 worth on pricecharting.com. And in comparison, you know, my PlayStation 2 video, I had 250 games, and you know, a couple of consoles, and it sits at about $8,000. So just goes to show how valuable the Sega Saturn is as a whole, and how valuable it is to collectors to be able to get a decent collection. So speaking of dollar value, what I'll do now is I'll go you through my top 5 most valuable games that I have in my collection. It was actually a couple of surprises in there. One's obviously not a surprise, but there is a couple of surprises in there. So let's get stuck into it. Coming in at number 5, everyone who has a Saturn's probably heard of this game, Guardian Heroes. For those who've never played Guardian Heroes or don't know what it's about, it's essentially a beat-em-up game. And the good thing about it is it's not just an out-and-out beat-em-up game. There's a couple of other elements to it as well. But you know, it's a really good game, and it's really well known in Sega Saturn circles. I don't think it was an arcade game, but yeah, I've got an NTSC copy, as you can see here. A little bit more valuable than what the PAL version is. And this game sits at number 5 in the most expensive games that I have in my collection, and Price Charting's got it sitting at about $320 for a complete copy. So coming in at number 4 on the most valuable games that I have in my collection, 3 Dirty Dwarfs. Love this game. I love the name of this game as well. It's great. Once again, for those who don't know what 3 Dirty Dwarfs are, it's once again a beat 'em up. It's a fun game to play. It's quite comical. Has an interesting storyline. Essentially, you're 3 dwarves that get transported from an RPG game into real life. Somehow end up in a sports store, grabs all the weapons, and you go around beating up the people who essentially are enslaving, I suppose, or brainwashing some kids. So, interesting story, very fun to play, very cartoony, and I highly recommend, if you don't have it in your collection, to grab a copy of it. I know it's not cheap, and Price Charting has this sitting at about $340 Australian dollars for a complete copy. So coming in at number 3 is a game called Swagman. Now, some of you guys might be familiar with Swagman from the PS1. It was a Saturn game ported over to the PS1. This copy is actually probably a little bit more expensive than what's reflected in Price Charting, because it's quite highly sought after by Australian collectors, because it is, you can see on the back there, it is an Aussie soft copy of it as well. So, and that tends to hold a little bit more value, particularly in Australia, because Aussie Soft was the distributor in Australia for it, rather than getting imported from Europe. Now, for those who don't know what Swagman is, it's a top-down sort of adventure game. There's platforming elements to it as well, and you know, it's not a bad game. It's not one of my favourite games, but it's certainly not a bad game by any stretch of the imagination. And I suppose why it's so highly sought after, it didn't sell very well for the Saturn, and it's not a bad game as well. So those two combinations mixed together generally pushes the price of the game up. But yeah, number 3 is Swagman, and it sits at about 360 odd Australian dollars on Price Charting. So coming in at number 2 as the most valuable in my collection, Ko2 Flying Squadron. For those who don't know what Ko is, essentially the first one was predominantly just a shooter, side-scrolling shooter. Ko2 is actually a platformer, and it still has some shooting elements as well in it. Quite popular in Japan, and it's quite hard to get a hold of actually. So, and it comes in at number 2. It sits at about 380, 390 Australian dollars on Price Charting. So number 1, what could be number 1? What possibly could be number 1, the most expensive game in the Sega Saturn? Well, I'm pretty sure everyone knows what the answer to that's going to be. That's Panzer Dragoon Saga. Now, I'm a fan of the first 2 games, which are essentially oh, they're not essentially, they are rail shooters. So you're a guy sitting on a dragon, and the dragon follows a set path, and you shoot all the targets that come in within that range. Now, there are other elements to it, like you do have to spin your view around left, right, the back, because they do come from all directions. So that's the first two games, but this one goes off in a totally different direction. It's just a straight out RPG. I can't recall any rail shooter or shooter rail elements to it, but it's a massive game. It takes 4 discs, and then it comes in this outer box as well. So it's quite hard to find complete because of so many elements to the packaging itself. So you've got the outer box, you've got the 2 cases, you've got the 4 discs, then you've got the manuals, etc. So to get it complete, it's quite hard to find, and that's probably why it's so expensive. Now, a lot of people regard this as the best Sega Saturn game. I don't regard it as the best Sega Saturn game, but I can understand why people might regard it as the best Sega Saturn game. It was a really late release, and if the rumours are true, apparently Sega somehow lost the source code for the making of this. So that's for the game itself. So that's apparently the reason why it's never been remade. Now I refuse to believe that. Not that they lost it, but Sega back in the day, God knows, they've done a lot of silly things. But the fact that all the engineering, all the technology to this day, you can't remake it. Come on, kidding me, aren't you? But whether they do or they don't, I don't know. But it's number 1, obviously, in the most valuable Sega Saturn games in my collection, and price charting for a complete copy has it sitting at about $890 odd Australian. So that's it for the top 5 games, or my top 5 most valuable games in my collection. What I'll do is I'll actually, before I go on to my 3 favourite games, I'm going to run you through some games I've got in my collection that might not make everyone's top 5 or top 10 games, but I think you should give these games a try. So the first one I'm going to pick for a game you need to play if you own a Sega Saturn is, I actually don't know how to pronounce the Japanese way of doing it. It's Jiku, anyway, it's Proteus Forever with me. If you haven't played these sort of games before, they're made by Konami. They are a shooter, side-scrolling shooter, but they're kind of a fun side-scrolling shooter. They're very cartoony. They're heavily violent. Shoot spaceships down, etc. So, and the music to them is really cool as well. So, if you've ever played a game, and I had it on my PlayStation 2 for We Love Katamari, then the music to this is kind of in that vein. It's that really, I suppose, quirky type of music, really catchy, and it's a really fun game to play. So I don't believe it's that expensive. I don't know if it was released outside of Japan. You don't really need to understand Japanese to be able to play this game. It's a fun shooter, and I recommend if you get the chance, give it a crack. I'm going to give this a crack. It's Jiku Oisia Berry Proteus Forever with me. So give it a crack. So another one I highly recommend is Bubble Bobble and Rainbow Island. So essentially this is 2 games in one, 2 of the original arcade classics. I'm sure all the retro guys out there have played Bubble Bobble before. They've also played Rainbow Island before. So if you enjoyed those games, highly recommend that you pick up a copy of this particular game, or this particular version of the 2 games. It's a really good conversion, and I really enjoy playing it as well. So I know the game was available across multiple consoles, but I feel it was quite well done on the Sega Saturn. So if you get a chance, pick up a copy of it, give it a run. Another one that I highly recommend if you've got a Saturn collection, usually doesn't make anyone's top 10 list or most valuable, but it's Blazing Dragons. Now, I think this is also available on PlayStation 1, and I'm sort of laughing just thinking about it. For those who don't know what Blazing Dragons is, if you're into Monty Python, then give this game a run. It's quite humorous. It's a point-and-click game. I don't think there's actually a real end to the game either. The puzzles in it are quite challenging as well, but for me, it's not so much the gameplay, it's the humour, it's the funny side of it. You can't take it too seriously, but it is a fun game to play. I think the PlayStation 1 had the PlayStation 1 version had Harry Shearer and Cheech Marin as the voices. And this one's actually got Terry Jones from the Monty Python series as well, voice acting in it. So if you've got a Saturn collection and you come across this, then give it a run. I highly recommend it, especially if you're into the Monty Python type humour.
I beg your pardon?
Yes, what can I do for you?
Can I have some useless information?
The most visited spot in all of Camel Hut is the King's bathroom. Ever since he went on that liquid ruby diet, the King's been in there 5 times an hour.
So, one for the RPG fans, and I know this game is quite expensive. It doesn't make my best games that I play. It doesn't make the list for my best games, and also doesn't make the list for the most expensive games. But if you're looking for what I think is the best RPG on the Sega Saturn, it's this one, Shining Force 3. If you're a fan of Sega, then you would know the Shining series or the Shining Force series. This one, I think this was only released. Number 3 was the only one released on the Sega Saturn in the PAL regions. I don't think the other 2 were released, but they did have another series of games, Shining Holy Ark and Shining Wisdom, that were released in PAL regions as well, which they're the same series, but they're really different games. The Shining the Holy Ark and Shining Wisdom are more 3D, RPGs. This one's definitely a 2D RPG. It does have some 3D scenes in it as well, but I think this is the best by far RPG that, especially in the PAL regions, that you can get on the Sega Saturn. So if you enjoy your RPGs, then I highly recommend Shining Force 3. So the next one I'm picking is a game that you'd probably need to play if you own a Sega Saturn. Not the most expensive, not the best game, but certainly you should give this a run. And that's the Bitmap Brothers Z. If you haven't played this game or seen this game before, it's a real-time strategy game. It's not super difficult to play, and it's based around more that rather than build up your army and go and attack another base or the like, such as your StarCrafts and that type of thing, it's more you just have to get to a certain checkpoint or capture a certain area with the soldiers that you've got. It's a fun game to play. It's not really that hard, and the AI it's not super great, but if you're looking to kill some time and you're not after a super difficult game, a fun game to play as well. It's nice and colourful, sounds good. Then I highly recommend you give the Bitmap Brothers Z a run.
Nope. And robot manufactured.
Unit.
Smoking.
Now, the last game I'm going to recommend, I could spend all day here recommending games, but the last one I'm going to recommend, it's an odd one. And you're probably thinking, what the hell is he doing recommending this game? But hey, we're in lockdown in Sydney, so I highly recommend giving this game a run. That's Sea Bass Fishing. Whoever hasn't played the series before, I think there was a couple of versions on the Dreamcast as well. But all in all, this is a really fun game to play. It's an arcade game. It's quite hard on arcade mode. But if you're not playing arcade mode and you just want to kill a few hours, this game is really well made. If you're into your fishing games, I'm not really into my fishing games, but I found this game really enjoyable to play. I highly recommend it. Give it a run. Sea Bass Fishing. So now let's talk about the 3 favourite games that I have in my Saturn collection. Kicking it off with number 3. It's a driving game, so it might surprise a few people, but I really enjoyed this game. I mentioned it before, Daytona USA Championship Circuit Edition. Now this is not the original Daytona USA. I found the original Daytona USA on the Saturn was very short. The music was kind of crappy in it as well, but I think they've done a better job with this version of it. So if you do get a chance to pick up Daytona, I highly recommend you pick up the Championship Circuit Edition. It just has more tracks, better music, but the gameplay is essentially the same. And as I said, I think before, I spent many dollars on this in the arcade, and I think Sega have done a really good job porting this over as well. So number 3, as my favourite games in my Saturn collection is Daytona USA Championship Circuit Edition. Coming in at number 2 is my favourite Sega Saturn games, and that's Panzer Dragoon, the first one, which might surprise a few people. A lot of people are probably expecting the second one, but I don't know what it is about the first one that I really enjoyed. Maybe because I've played it more than the second one, I don't know. But I really enjoyed this game. I know it's getting remade, and I'm just waiting for Limited Run to actually deliver my PS4 version of the remake. So I really enjoyed it. For those who don't know what it is, it's a rail shooter. You're on a dragon, you follow a certain path. You do have to steer it a little bit around certain obstacles, but essentially you're there to shoot all the stuff around you. You do have a 3D view, so you have a front view, then you click the side buttons to rotate the camera around because the enemies come from all different directions, and then typically at the end of each section you're confronted with a boss. So if you haven't played this series before, start with Panzer Dragoon and work your way up. Certainly don't start with Panzer Dragoon Saga because that, although it's the same series, it's a totally different game. That's an RPG, whereas this is a rail shooter. So coming at number 2, Panzer Dragoon. So coming at number 1 for my my favourite Sega Saturn game of all time that I have in my collection anyway. And that's this one, Nights into Dreams. Now, I'm not sure what it is about this game that I love so much. Could be the controls, could be the story, it could be the colour, could be all three of them all mixed together, but it's a hard game to describe. It's a very fluid game. Essentially, without getting too much into the story, you're a character that flies around in a sort of 3D world, and it has all these acrobatic moves, and it's just a really fun game to play. It's quite difficult. It was developed by the Sonic team, which unfortunately the Sonic team didn't do too well with on their Sonic games, I feel anyway, on the Saturn, but they certainly did a very good job with Nights into Dreams. There's also another version of this called Christmas Nights into Dreams, which I think, if it's correct, I have a copy of it here, so I have to give it a go. Someone told me if I change the date and it registers that you're playing it at Christmas time, then the scenery actually changes to a winter scenery. So anyway, I'll give that a crack later on actually, but if you've got a Sega Saturn, then definitely give Nights into Dreams a crack, and always play it with the 3D control pad if you can, because it just makes the motion and the controls so much better, and the character so much easier to control when you're using that analog control stick. So there it is, number 1, my favourite game in Sega Saturn collection. It's Nights into Dreams. So that's it from me, guys. Thanks for watching the video. Thanks for sticking it out to the end. For those of you who are interested, I will be making some more videos. I've had a heap of people subscribe over the last couple of weeks, so much appreciated. And you know, more people subscribe, I suppose, the more videos I'm going to keep making. We are in lockdown in Sydney, so I've got plenty of time on my hands. Big shout out to everyone. There's been some really nice comments and some feedback on Facebook groups, on Instagram, etc. So I will post a link to my Instagram account where I take photos of my collection and things I just muck around with during the day, and modifications, etc. So if you want to follow me, by all means, click on the Instagram link that I'll put in the comments, and I'll see you there. So anyway, thanks for watching to the end, guys. Much appreciated, and I'll see you in the next video.